بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم وأكمل التحيات على سيد السادات سيدنا ونبينا محمد خير البريات وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. Alhamdulillah, in our lessons on the acquiring of taqwa, in which we're looking at the section of Imam Birgivi's great manual on taqwa, Tariqa al-Muhammadiyya, the path of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we are blessed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to have looked first at the importance of taqwa as mentioned in the Quran, then the importance of taqwa as mentioned in the Sunnah of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That took the first, and then the rational importance of taqwa. Right? And we left last class by looking at the fact that, and then we looked at the definition of taqwa, tafsir al-taqwa. That taqwa in the Arabic language, what is it? It's to carefully guard oneself from harm. Right? Faratu siyana. And there's a general religious sense of taqwa, which is to carefully guard oneself and to keep away from all that is disadvantageous to us in our hereafter. And the specific religious sense of taqwa, or you can say the operational definition of taqwa, is carefully guarding oneself from disobeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Today we're going to look at the pathways of taqwa. How is this? What do we need to guard in order to uphold taqwa? And it's a very important discussion. Right? It's a very important discussion. So, what do we need to guard? Right? These are what's called the pathways of taqwa. And then from that, we are going to look, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, at the that what taqwa requires, its pathways. Then we're going to look at then we're going to look at why the most important of the pathways of taqwa is the heart, and why it comes first. And we're going to look at what is the good state of the heart, which is acquiring good character. Right? So this is a really important chapter, and here we will see what is the relationship between taqwa and good character, and husn al-khuluq. And then what is the reality of character. So we'll be going a little bit slower through some of this than other texts, than other parts of the work, just because of the great sensitivity of some of what we are looking at. So, the author begins, rahimahullah ta'ala, by telling us what taqwa requires. So he tells us, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayhi, that النوع الثالث في مجاريها أي في مجاري التقوى, on the pathways of taqwa. He says, اعلم أن التقوى لا تحصل إلا باجتناب المنكرات والمنهي عنها وإتيان المعروفات والمأمور بها. Know well that taqwa, which is guarding oneself against the displeasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is not attained except by leaving wrong things and the things that are prohibited. Right? The haram and the makruh tahriman. And by doing what has been commanded and made obligatory. Why? Because leaving what is commanded, leaving the obligatory things, entails that you committed a haram. Right? Leaving the obligatory is haram, leaving the wajib is makruh tahriman, is prohibitively disliked. إذ ترك المأمور به يستحق العقوبة, because leaving what you've been commanded to do makes you deserving of punishment. ولكن المتبادر منها ومن الذنوب في أول السماع الوجوديات كالزنا وشرب الخمر. But what comes to mind first from when you mention taqwa is to guard oneself from sins, right? If you first hear about it, right? So here he makes a point that the first sense of taqwa is what? To guard oneself from disobedience. But there's a secondary meaning of it, which is to safeguard the obedience to Allah, because not safeguarding obedience to Allah entails disobedience to Allah, mighty and majestic, right? So that's why this is a subtle point that is important to be clear about. Yani, للعدميات, that the first impression of taqwa does not encompass the non-actions, مثل ترك الصلاة والصوم, such as leaving prayer and fasting. مع كونه من أكبر الكبائر, right? Despite leaving prayer and leaving fasting is of the biggest of enormities. فلنذكر الوجوديات مفصلا ثم العدميات. So we'll mention both what you must do to be a person of taqwa and what one must avoid, right? مجملا, right? In brief, right? فنقول, so we say المنكر إما مخصوص بعضو معين أو لا, that the wrong, right? The wrong deeds. So the wujudiyat, the things that must be left, are of two types. The prohibitions are of two types. Those that are specific to a limb, or those that are not specific to a limb, right? والأول في الغالب ثمانية, right? And the first of these, meaning those sins that are specific to a limb, are broadly 8, right? Because there are sins related to the nails, for example, right? There's sins that would be related to your hair, whatever, but those are derivative from other limbs. You can categorize them, the hands and the other things, right? Those are, right? Those are rare. So sins that relate to the limbs are 8, and there's the 9th, which are the sins that are not specific to a particular limb, right? And what are these? He lists these, right? He says, qalbun, the heart. And he mentions this first because it is the most significant. And this is the heart of the book. The heart of the Tariqa al-Muhammadiyya is this chapter that we're looking at, which is on the attainment of taqwa. And the heart of the book is this section that we're about to approach, which is when we will be looking at the heart. وَأُذُنٌ, and the ears. And the ears are mentioned second, either because of order, but because what comes through the ear impacts you more than even what comes through the eyes. وَعَيْن, and the eyes. وَلِسَان, and the tongue. وَيَد, and the hand. وَبَطْن, and the stomach. وَفَرْج, and the private parts, meaning one's desires. وَرِجْل, and one's feet. Right? So these are the feet or the legs, right? So these are the 8 pathways of taqwa. So what is our duty? Right? فَعَلَى السَّالِكِ, so the one who seeks to, the seeker, meaning the one who is seeking to pursue the path of the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the one who seeks to pursue the path of Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam, the one who wishes to pursue the closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. أن يحفظ كل عضو من كل معصية, that they guard every limb from every sin. That they carefully guard, and this is the meaning of taqwa, each limb from disobedience, from every sin. And they keep this active guarding حتى يكون له ملكة, until this becomes a capacity and an aptitude, right? This is done by establishing good habits, holding oneself to actively avoid it, to make it a habit to leave sin, and the opposite, of course, therefore, and make it a habit to do good deeds with the limbs until this becomes a malaka, a capacity, a malaka. فَيَنْخَرِطَ فِي سِلْكِ الْمُتَّقِينَ. So then one would be considered by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be of the people of taqwa. Right? So he says, فَلَا بُدَّ مِن تِسْعَةِ أَصْنَافٍ. So there are 9 categories. The 8 specific pathways of taqwa, which are the 8 limbs, plus the 9th, which are the guarding oneself from the sins that are not specific to a particular limb. And so he begins with the heart, right? So that's what we look at in part 2, right? So this is how you acquire taqwa. You have to be aware that there are things, taqwa entails guarding oneself, and it helps to know that there are these areas that you have to guard yourself from. So we know what taqwa is, to guard oneself from disobeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that entails to carefully protect one's obedience to Allah with each of these limbs. So he looks at الفصل الأول الصنف الأول في منكرات القلب. The first category is in those sins, those wrong acts that are related to the heart. And in this we'll look at why the heart matters, why it comes first, and making it a habit to leave the sins of the heart. This relates to the acquisition, to understanding how the heart works and what is character, what is khuluq. And this is an amazing, although Imam al-Birgivi is writing in an educational context, right? He writes based on and he's not being difficult, because the people he's addressing, students of knowledge, scholars, students of knowledge, and the educated, someone who can read his works, someone who's educated, who's been through a basic classical education. And a basic classical education in the Ottoman times trained the basically educated person in grammar, and in logic, and in rhetoric. And even if you didn't get the rhetoric, just grammar and logic, so you can think in a structured manner. Now sometimes we can't, so it really helps to take notes, right? When reading things like that, it helps to take notes. We've tried to break it down a little bit for you. Right? في منكرات القلب وآفاته, in the sins of the heart and its harms. He says, rahimahullah, اعلم أن صلاحه أهم من كل شيء, that the rectification of the heart is more important than anything else. إذ هو ملك مطاع, because the heart is a king that is obeyed. The human being, as it were, right? The reality of the human being, right? Which is not just your body, but the human being is like a city. The city is not the city by its buildings, but the city is a city by its people. Right? The buildings are just the means. Right? It's not the walls, but the people. In the city of you, right? There are the various faculties. But there's a king to the castle that is you. When a society, when a society is sane, it has peace and goodness, there is law and order, right? There isn't looting taking place, there's no crimes, etc. When the king, right, or the ruler is in charge of the affairs, and that's the heart. That's the heart. The other limbs are all in a state of wellness if the king, which is the heart, is in control. If anyone else besides the king is in control, then there will be trouble. Right? And this is a profound statement. Imam al-Ghazali breaks this down a lot more extensively in Marvels of the Heart and uses some beautiful metaphors. Right? The king, the heart is a malik muta', nafiz al-hukm. The rulings of the heart are obeyed by wal-a'dha' ra'iyya, and the other limbs are the followers of the heart. Wa khadam, and the servants of the king. فلذا قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم ألا وإن في الجسد مضغة الحديث, which is why the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم said that truly in the body is a morsel of flesh, right? Is a morsel, is a small matter. إذا صلحت صلح الجسد كله. If rectified, the entire body is rectified. وإذا فسدت, and if corrupted, the entire فسد الجسد كله. Right? And if corrupted, the entire body is corrupted. ألا وهي القلب. Truly, it is the heart. Right? So, what does it mean to rectify the heart? He says, وإصلاحه تخليته عن الأوصاف الذميمة. The rectification of the heart is to rid the heart of blameworthy traits of character. Right? Its rectification is ridding itself of the blameworthy traits of character. وَتَحْلِيَتُهُ بِالْأَوْصَافِ الْحَمِيدَةِ, and adorning it with praiseworthy traits of character. فَلَا بُدَّ مِنْ قِسْمَيْنِ. Right? So we require two things. الأول في تفسير الخلق. First, we have to look at what is good character. وَبَيَانُ مَنْشَئِهِ, and where does good character arise from? Right? وَتَقْسِيمُهُ إِلَى مَذْمُومٍ وَمَمْدُوحٍ. So we need to look at first what is good character, and where does character arise from, and the division of character into blameworthy and praiseworthy. وطريق إزالة الأول, and how does one rid oneself of blameworthy character? وعلاجه, and how does one treat bad character? إجمالا, in general. وتحصيل الثاني, and how does one acquire good character? وإبقائه, and how does one preserve good character? وحفظ صحته, and protect the wellness of one's character or of the heart. وتقويته, and to strengthen good character. إجمالا, overall, in general. Right? So he lays down here, this is you can use fancy terminology for it. This is what underlies character. Because the heart, right? The heart has sins of the heart, and it has good qualities of the heart. And the action of the heart relate to character. The actions of the limbs are furu', are the details of the state of the heart. Right? So this is profound, right? This is profound. So he tells us, right? And this is why we're going a little bit slower in this section than other parts of the text in this month, because this is deep, and this is a section that if you're taking this class seriously, you would do well to repeat listening to several times, right? Because it's rich, right? So what will he do? He'll first tell us what is character, then what are the sources of character. There are certain human essential, what makes a human human, right? Which is not your body setup, but that subtlety that makes you human has 3 fundamental capacities that all character arises from. How does one channel those so that good character is manifest and bad character is not manifest? Right? And all success and failure in life depends on that. قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ زَكَّاهَا وَقَدْ خَابَ مَنْ دَسَّاهَا. Successful is the one who rectifies it, and a failure indeed is the one who corrupts it. So he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, Allahumma salli wa sallim wa barik ala Sayyidina Muhammad. What does he say? So he gives us a definition of character. فَنَقُول. So he says, so we say. So what is character? Al-khuluq. He says, al-khuluq malakatun تصدر عنها الأفعال النفسانية بسهولة. Character is a capacity by which human actions arise with ease, arise without من غير روية, without requiring deep thought or effort. Right? This is a definition of character. Character is very, very simple, is how you are. That naturally causes you to do what you do. Right? It's a capacity, but from which human actions naturally arise. So someone's generous, they see a poor person, what is their natural inclination? To give. Someone's caring, a child is crying, do they have to think about, should I help him or not? The one who has caring as a character, as rahmah or shafaqah, they have this quality. From that, the resultant action would arise without consideration, thought, effort. So that's why the acquisition of character is so important. When you have these, we have virtuous traits, they facilitate good deeds. حسن الأعمال نتائج حسن الأحوال. Right? Good deeds are the results of good states. And now, because it's a natural state of being, some people said, well, then you can't change it. Right? That's just how you are. So he says, وَيُمْكِنُ تَغْيِيرُهُ. That's why the issue arises, can you change character? So he says, it is possible to change. What's the proof that it's possible to change? And this is a lengthy argument amongst the philosophers and others. They say, no, that's just how you are. And a lot of people say, why are you grumpy? I said, but that's just the way I am. What? They're making an implicit statement. They say, that's just how I am. They say, that's my character. Character does not change, therefore I will not change. Where is the false premise there? Yeah, because character does change. But the person will say, prove it. Prove it. Right? Right? So this is why the classical texts are addressing thinking people. Right? Someone could argue, well, that's just the way I am. I've struggled all my life to change it. Well, it's possible to change. And this is deeply empowering. Why? Firstly, لِوُرُودِ الشَّرْعِ بِهِ. Right? Because the revelation, divine guidance has come with explicit and implicit affirmations that character changes. قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ زَكَّاهَا وَقَدْ خَابَ مَنْ دَسَّاهَا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that the human being has been granted aptitudes. وَنَفْسٍ وَمَا سَوَّاهَا, the self and how Allah has fashioned it. قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ زَكَّاهَا أي سعى في تزكيتها. Right? The one successful is the one who purifies it or rectifies it, means takes the means towards its rectification. وَقَدْ خَابَ, and the loser is the one مَنْ دَسَّاهَا, who allows it to become corrupted. Right? And there's also hadiths. حَسِّنُوا أَخْلَاقَكُمْ. Right? Rectify your character. Right? There's many hadiths about that. That's one. وَاتِّفَاقِ الْعُقَلَاءِ, and all sane people would affirm that it is possible. At the very least, they would affirm it is possible. Right? And number three, التجربة, experience. Right? Experience. Right? But at the same time, وَتَخْتَلِفُ الْإِسْتِعْدَادَاتُ فِيهِ. Right? People's capacities differ with respect to how easily their character changes, بِحَسَبِ الْأَمْزِجَةِ, in accordance with their temperaments. In accordance with their temperaments. Right? And there's some really nice discussions regarding this in the right? Right? That some people have some good qualities that are more manifest than others. The Prophet ﷺ said in the famous hadith to al-Ashaj ibn al-Ashaj, right? إِنَّ فِيكَ لَخَصْلَتَيْن يُحِبُّهُمَا اللَّهُ. Truly you have two traits. So he just come to Medina. The Prophet ﷺ said, you have two traits that Allah loves. Which are? Al-Hilm wal-Ana, forbearance and circumspection. Right? Right? Okay. Then he discusses something nuanced, right? And he puts it in brief. So we're going to take a deep breath. Don't be scared. But this is profound, it's powerful, right? So he says, وَمَنْشَأُهُ, the bases of good character. And the bases of good character. Right? What character arises? What is character? Character is a capacity, right? Character is a capacity. But what is the basis? Where does this capacity arise? It's a capacity, right? It's a capacity. What does it do? It's a capacity, either positive capacity or negative capacity, from which actions arise. Good character, good actions arise from. Bad character, bad actions, outward or inward, arise from. But underlying that are three foundational capacities, three bases of character. وَمَنْشَأُهُ قُوَّ النَّفْسِ. Right? There are three bases of character. These are the three capacities of the human self. Right? And by the human self, the nafs, what is meant is that subtlety that makes you human. Right? There's subtlety that makes you human. Are you human yet? You have a self. What is it? It's that subtlety that makes you human, from which cognition, idrak, arises. Where does cognition arise from? We don't know the ultimate reality of our own self. But we know it's there because we're human. Right? It's like the car. If you don't know how the engine works, but you know it works, so what do? Drive carefully. So I can't drive carefully because I don't know how my car works. No, you can drive correctly. That's what you're responsible for. Are you responsible for knowing how your engine works? No. To the extent that you know how to fix it, etc., same. Right? There's something that drives you, but there are capacities. وَهِيَ ثَلَاث. There are three quwa of the nafs. There's three underlying capacities of the human self. Right? النطق وهو قوة الإدراك. So these three, we'll mention them in summary and then look at them. The first is the rational capacity, right? Which is the capacity of discernment, reason. The second capacity is قوة الغضب, right? The capacity for anger. And the third is the capacity for desire, right? Right? These, so basically, and these, each of them, now some people get all flustered here. They say, Greek. So hold on. This is a description of a human being, right? So if a medicine was invented by, if someone before Islam praised honey, does it mean we give up honey? No, because it's praised in the one, because it's praised in our tradition, in Revelation. Number two, tajruba, experience shows that it's beneficial, right? Likewise, intellectual things. These are just truths. Other people are aware of the truth too, but these are affirmed in our tradition, right? You need the emphasis on using your reason is fundamental in the Quran. The important, this, and we'll look at each of these capacities, right? The importance of having having an active driver. And that's what anger does. And their desires. Both anger and desire can be negative and it can be positive. So we look at these, right? This is the framework, right? And the summary, because it's not a murder mystery, the summary is that each of these has excessiveness. And each of these has remissness. These are three capacities. Each of these has an excessiveness and each of these has a remissness. Too much or too little. Right? So for there to be law and order, goodness, virtue in the city of the human self, reason has to be the vizier, right? So the heart is the king. The king, the wise king, would have a good governor. That the governor for the city of the self is reason. The reason deploys anger, which is like strength, and desire in a good way. But reason deploys them in the ways that are good, and it restrains them from ways that are bad. So it's like, anger is like the police force or the army. If the army decides we want to kill everybody, the city doesn't remain anymore. But if the army or the police doesn't do anything, there'll be chaos. If there's no desire, there'll be no economy, right? Because no one seeks anything, we'll starve. There'll be no children born, right? So the reason has to know how to govern these other two capacities, right? So we'll see these, right? So let's look at these three bases of character. The first, the rational capacity, right? What is the rational capacity? Huwa quwwatul idrak, is the strength of discernment by which you distinguish benefit and harm, good or bad, right or wrong, advantage, disadvantage. Each of these has a balance, an excess, and a remissness. Right? It's excess, remissness, and the goal is the virtuous balance, al-wasat, or it's al-i'tidal. So what is the balance of reason? فَاعْتِدَالُهُ الْحِكْمَةِ. Its balance is wisdom. The balance of reason is wisdom. What is wisdom? هي ملكة للنفس تدرك بها الصواب عن الخطأ. Reason, the virtuous balance of reason is wisdom, which is when reason is able to distinguish beneficial outcomes from harmful outcomes. Right? And there's many other definitions of hikmah. Right? And this is a very nice discussion on the various definitions of wisdom in the commentary. And keep track of that. Right? Because wisdom is highly praised. But it's a capacity. Wisdom, the balance of reason is when you have wisdom. Right? The capacity to discern right from wrong, or beneficial outcomes from harmful outcomes. That is when reason in it is balanced. Because reason, what could you do? You could use reason to just spread harm. يُفْسِدُونَ فِي الْأَرْضِ. Someone could reason how they can hurt themselves. Right? How someone says, okay, how do they bring alcohol into the house without the rest of the family finding out, or whatever else. Right? So reason can be used in good or bad. Right? So this is its balance. When reason is balanced, وَإِفْرَاطُهُ, right? وَإِفْرَاطُهُ الْجَرْبَزَ, right? Or الجربزة, right? Right? وهي ملكة إدراك يدعو إلى اطلاع ما لا يمكن إدراكه. Right? كالمتشابهات. Right? وبحث القدر. Right? أو ملكة تصدر بها أفعال يتضرر الغير بها. Right? The excessiveness of the intellect is to use the intellect in harmful ways, which is either in intellectual harm, where so the balance is you use the intellect towards what is ultimately good, of the good of this life or the good of the next. That is beneficial intellect, and that's called wisdom. Excess, rational excess, is for the intellect to actively proceed in harm, either rational harm, right, which is for it to get into things that the mind cannot know. I want to rationally understand the reality of God. You can't, right? I want to understand just purely rationally the mutashabihat, the matters that are unclear, right? Of what, of the things that Allah has chosen to leave unclear in the Quran. Or I want to understand the reality of divine decree and destiny, just by reason alone, unaided by revelation. Or this rational excessiveness is defined, is a capacity, it's directing reason towards harm, either to oneself or others, or either of the harm of this life or the next. It's actively using the intellect towards personal or public harm, rational or practical. So it's harmful overuse of intellect, right? And there's a remissness, tafriq, a remissness, not using, insufficient use of intellect, which is called foolishness, al-balada, foolishness, which is وهي ملكة يقصر بها صاحبها عن إدراك الخير والشر, which is a capacity, foolishness, which is when the one who has foolishness is unable to distinguish good and bad, or they simply don't distinguish good and bad. Right? Right? So, reason has a good balance, which is wisdom. You use the reason towards benefit, so you use reason towards benefit, worldly and next worldly, for yourself and others, while refraining it from harm for yourself or others. And that's wisdom. Imagine if there's a kid who's out of control and you live in an apartment building and the air conditioning is not working, so you've got the window to the balcony, the door to the balcony open. He said, by the way, if kids, not all kids who jump off from the third floor die. So your child runs and they jump off the balcony and they die. That's excessive reasoning. Right? Because you harmed someone else. Your kid died because you said not everyone who jumps off the balcony dies, and your kid's foolish. But guess where they got it from, right? So, and this is the idea of the virtuous balance. It's a virtuous balance, which is wisdom. There's an excessive reasoning, right? Which is, you get into things that are unknowable, or that harm you or harm others, right? Worldly matters or next worldly matters. And there is foolishness, which is not using the intellect or not acquiring the ability to use the intellect. So you are unable or don't direct this capacity of cognition, right, of reason, of thinking, towards the pursuit of your benefit of this life and the next, for yourself or for others. Right? So that is the rational capacity. Then we have the capacity for anger. That's the second. Al-ghadab. And sometimes they call this al-quwwa al-ghadabiyya. Right? Al-ghadab. Anger. Now, is anger negative? No. Anger typically is manifest negatively, but the capacity for anger is very important, because underlying it, we recognize that the human being is an animal, right? Now, and we're surrounded by animals, other people, right? If you didn't have a faculty by which you ward off harm from yourself or from others, you're going to be harmed. That's just basic reason, right? If you're hungry, you're just an animal, and you're not governed by religion or anything else. If you're hungry and your neighbor has a lot of food, and you know that if you go and take his food, he's not going to stop you, you're going to go take his food. That's just what the animal instinct would do, and not believing otherwise is just being foolish. To the extent that people aren't governed by reason, but reason, what drives reason? There has to be something driving. Why would someone be decent? There has to be underlying values. But why would they have those values? So, well, that's what society says. But what is society, right? Sometimes the smartest people do the most evil things because they don't care, because they think a little bit. And that's harmful reason. Right? Sometimes, if you look at mass killers, they have very sophisticated manifestos because they think a lot. Right? Al-ghafla madharu rahmatillah. Right? Heedlessness is mercy from Allah. Most people thought a little bit. Why should they care? Why should they care? It's good that they do, but there's not much of a, a rational basis where the philosophers have talked about this, and people. And religion tells us about that too. So, what is anger then? The capacity for anger, he says, al-ghadab وهو حركة النفس دفعا للمنافر. Right? It's a movement of the self to ward off what is disliked, right? Immediately or long term, right? Right? And it has a manifesting, right? That's the natural inclination to ward off things that you dislike or that are odious to you. It has an excess, it has a remissness, and it has a virtuous balance. What is the virtuous balance of anger? Because anger is this capacity to incline towards warding off what you dislike. Right? To actively push back against what you dislike. He says, فَاعْتِدَالُهُ الشَّجَاعَةِ. Its balance is courage, which is a capacity by which one directs oneself to matters that one should direct oneself towards. It's courage. Right? So someone's beating up an old lady. Courage is that you step in and say, stop, even though the person's bigger and stronger than you. Right? So it is this capacity to stand up to, is to capacity to direct yourself to that which you should direct oneself towards, of that which is that which you should dislike. Its excessiveness is to being out of control, tahawwur, right? Which is a capacity that causes one to direct oneself, right? To direct this anger to things that are unbecoming, right? Anything that you dislike, you get mad about. Someone does something, you tear it, so that's excessiveness, right? وَتَفْرِيطُهُ الْجُبْنِ. Its remissness, lack of anger, is cowardice. When you have وَهُوَ هَيْئَةٌ رَاسِخَةٌ بِهَا يَحْجُمُ عَنْ مُبَاشَرَةِ مَا يَنْبَغِي. And cowardice is a deep tendency to hold back from what you should do. So you know that there's someone wronging someone else. So you go to the supermarket, inshallah after everything is fine, and there is someone beating up their kid. But what if they beat me up? So you just don't do anything. Why? That's cowardice. You have this capacity within you. Right? Now, excessiveness would be that you not only stop them, but you go beat them up. That is tahawwur. That's excessive, that's rage or uncontrolled anger. Right? Where you go beyond limits. Insufficient anger is you're not moved to ward off harm. That's what courage is. And you need anger in the path of self-rectification, because you must be at enmity to your bad tendencies. You need courage to change. Right? You need courage to change. So that's the anger capacity. So anger is not all negative, right? Because there's a positive anger which is courage, where you know what needs to be changed, right? And you have the capacity to direct yourself to what needs to be changed, even though you have fears towards yourself or towards others. But with balance, without excessiveness, where that anger is destructive, and without remissness, where you don't do the change that is within your capacity without harm. That's the balance, and this is not easy, right? Anger is not easy. Courage is positive anger, right? It's directing more, rational and moral and spiritual displeasure towards positive ends, towards prevention of harm and attainment of good, without causing harm by being excessive, or without missing out on benefit, or the perpetuation of harm by being cowardly. والثالث, and the third of the third basis of character. So we saw the first basis of character is reason, right? The second basis of character, and this can be, sometimes they refer to this as, this is part of the animal self. The animal self has anger and it has desire. Has anger and it has desire. So the third of the capacities of the self is desire. الشهوة وهي حركة النفس طلبا للملائم. Right? Desire, right? Shahwa is defined as a movement of the self, right? Is yourself inclining towards the things you find pleasing, right? This too has an excessiveness, a remissness, and a virtuous balance. فَاعْتِدَالُهَا الْعِفَّةِ, the balance of desire, which is the inclination of the self towards the things it finds pleasing. This is the appetites. The typical appetites of the human being as an animal, the typical appetites are for food and drink, the fulfillment of sexual desire, and the fulfillment of its emotional and material desires, right? Of course, but then we also have a heart and a soul and an intellect. It too has its desires, and they can be good or bad too, right? But the right balance is iffa, is dignified restraint, right? Which is a capacity to pursue desired matters within the limits of divine guidance and dignified human conduct. Dignified restraint is that you pursue the natural desires of oneself, desires for food and drink, the desires for sexual fulfillment, the desires for material fulfillment, for emotional fulfillment, these things, but within the limits of shara, of divine guidance, and within the limits of human dignity, muru'ah, in a dignified manner. وَإِفْرَاطُهُ الشَّرَهُ, right? And its excessiveness is avidness, right? Right? وَالْفُجُورُ, and corruption, right? And he gives a definition, هو ملكة بها يتناول المشتهيات مطلقا. And avidness or sinful avidness, excessive avidness, or corruption is a capacity by which one pursues one's desires unconditionally, meaning without restraint. Right? So one goes towards restraint. وَتَفْرِيطُهُ الْخُمُودِ, and insufficient, and its remissness is al-khumud, right? Which is unfulfillment, right? وهو ملكة يقصر بها عن استيفاء ما ينبغي من المشتهيات. It's unfulfillment, is that you don't have enough desire to pursue what you should of desirable matters. You don't eat enough, not out of praiseworthy restraint, so you're weak and feeble. Why? Oh, well, whatever. So you don't eat enough, you don't drink enough, you don't fulfill your physical desires, and then that causes harm. You don't pursue your material needs, right? That's khumud, right? Allah has blessed you with money, you need shoes. Your feet are, let's say you have, your shoes have holes in them, your feet are getting older, whatever, right? It's not out of some praiseworthy renunciation, it's just because of lack of concern, right? Lack of desire, and that's not good, right? And then he gives us, so these are the three capacities, right? And then he makes a brief 3-line statement that very briefly, right? And this you should write out, like in Arabic, because this tells you why, classical texts are written for thinking people, and you need to think. So he says, والأوساط تحصل باستخدام الأول الأخيرين والأطراف تحصل باستخدامهما إياه والأطراف مطلقا والأوساط المشوب بها غرض فاسد رذائل فكل خلق مذموم ناشئ منها منفردة أو مجتمعا ببعضها أو كلها. Now, most educated Arabs listen to all of that, you would have no clue, and that's partly because and Arabs, God bless them, and others are lazy when it comes to their own language. Why? Because language has principles underlying it. Reason is the capacity to apply principles effectively, right? So the wise, intelligent person acquires the principles by which they're able to reason effectively. A wise person would know sufficient grammar, sufficient logic, sufficient rhetoric to pursue the good of this life and the good of the next. And you need that. So, he says, virtuous balance of the capacities of the heart, right? What are what is the virtuous balance? Namely, the attainment of wisdom, right, which is the virtue of the capacity of reason, and the virtue of the capacity of anger, which is courage, and the virtue of the capacity of desire, which is dignified restraint. These three virtuous balances, because the three capacities are reason, anger, and desire. What are their virtues? Reason has wisdom as virtue, anger has courage as virtue, desire has dignified restraint as virtue. How are these acquired? They're attained by the first capacity, namely reason, directing the other two capacities, namely anger and desire. Okay? You need to be angry enough to seek the good without harm, and to ward off harm without harm. And you have to have enough desire to fulfill your worldly needs, because the Prophet ﷺ said, "Nafsuka matiyatuka farfuq biha." Your own self is your mount, meaning on your journey to Allah. So go easy on it. You need to give it sufficient animal desires for it to sustain itself and for it not to rebel against you. So this virtuous balance, meaning the attainment of wisdom, courage, and dignified restraint, is by the first capacity, reason, directing the other two capacities, namely anger and desires. Right? And controlling them. So controlling them and channeling them. The extremes, right, happen, right, when the other two, the extremes meaning excessiveness and remissness, happen when these two capacities, anger and desires, direct reason. So you have uncontrolled desire, so you use your reason to figure out how to fulfill your desire in a blameworthy manner. You have anger, you are upset at your neighbor barbecuing late at night. So you hatch a plan to blow up their barbecue when they're at work. So you used your reason, but you used it contrary to wisdom, courage, and dignified restraint, right? And likewise, the virtues, and this is, likewise, the virtues themselves, are only virtuous if they are with a good aim. Because you could have courage, but misdirected courage, right? And misdirected courage is not blameworthy, right? So he said, وَالْأَوْصَاتِ الْمَشُوبُ بِهَا غَرَضٌ فَاسِدٌ. Because you could be wise, but what do you use wisdom for? Towards harmful aims. It's not a virtue. You have courage, but you fight for those who are spreading injustice. You're courageous, right? Whether in the field of the intellect, or in the field of battle, or in the field of politics, or other human affairs, there's misdirected courage. You have dignified restraint, but why? To manipulate others. Right? By influencing others with negative influence. That's not a virtue. Okay. So this is how virtue, so this is the basic of how we acquire that. So this is how we understand. So we looked at today that there are 8 pathways of taqwa, right? Which are the heart and the other limbs. The heart is the most important of these. So we look at it first. The heart, has traits. These are called khuluq, capacities. Underlying the capacity, and what is khuluq? Khuluq is a temperament by which actions arise with ease. So how you are, that naturally causes you to do what you do. How you are reflects a balance of 3 underlying capacities of the self. The capacity of reason, the capacity of anger, and the capacity of desire. Each of these has a balance which is praiseworthy: wisdom, courage, and dignified restraint. And all three have an excessiveness, which is when directed towards harm, and they have a remissness, when not directed towards benefit. And the key to change is for the mind to use reason, with wisdom, considering beneficial outcomes. So you direct your anger and your in the expression of courage, and you direct your restraint to pursue benefit and to prevent harm. The Prophet ﷺ, al-kayyisu man dana nafsahu. The smart person is the one who restrains their self. وَعَمِلَ لِمَا بَعْدَ الْمَوْتِ, and is therefore able to act for what comes after death. وَالْعَاجِز, and the incapable person, مَنْ أَتْبَعَ نَفْسَهُ هَوَاهَا, who allows his self to follow its whims, whether it's rational whims, or it's the whims of its anger, or the whims of its desires. ثُمَّ تَمَنَّ عَلَى اللَّهِ, but then has false hopes with Allah. And then he says, okay, so how do you acquire, how bad character is treated? So we're going to look at that next, right? How bad character is treated. And he gives an overall method for treating bad character. And we'll look at that next class. And the role of positive self-reproach, right? In this, right? And in how bad character is treated, he gives us a roadmap, right? An overall roadmap that you could apply to any self-change, right? And this is really critical, so we're not going to rush it. Then after that, he looks at the hadiths on blameworthy character and some hadiths on good character, right? And then he looks at 60 blameworthy traits of character and how we treat them, right? We're going to spend a little bit of time looking through this section on how character is acquired. And here some of the ulama look at the branches of these traits of character, right? These fundamental tendencies, which are three, they have derivative branches. And the commentators have mentioned these. We'll spend a little bit of time unpacking these, because these are quite useful, right? Before, bi'idhnillah. So this is how. So next lesson, we're going to look at how bad character is treated, and how one realizes the traits that need rectification within one. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين. Do you have any questions here, inshallah? If you're online, feel free to post your questions as well. Ya Rabb. Any questions? وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين.